Good morning, everyone. Welcome to a session on fake news and disinformation. My name is Kupferschmidt. I'm going to be the moderator of this session, and I have a great panel of guests, including one virtual contribution. But let me just say a few quick words. So we are obviously in the middle of a pandemic, but then if you believe the World Health Organization, for instance, we are also in the middle of an infodemic. And I think as a journalist who has been working on this for 1.5 years on reporting about COVID-19, of course, this is always at the front of our minds. How do we actually get good information out there, and how do people actually distinguish between different types of information? And I'm very happy to have a chance today to kind of take myself out of the day-to-day work on COVID-19 and talk a little bit about where in the bigger picture the information that I and my colleagues collect and try to distribute actually lands and what the context is for it. So I'm very happy that we have 4 people or contributions from 4 people who look at this from slightly different angles. And we'll actually start with a scientist who studied physics. Philipp Lorenz-Spreen is by training a physicist, but he now works on communication and information at the Max Planck Institute for Development here in Berlin. And he's going to start off with a brief introduction, and then we're going to go through the panels. Everybody's going to give a very short impulse, and then we'll head right into the discussion. Philipp, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. Yes. So that's correct. I am working on the information ecosystem, so where mis and disinformation is one of the symptoms, I would say, and I'm trying to look at this in an even broader picture to understand what are the mechanisms of information spreading on social networks, especially this self-organized character of these new systems, where we went from a one-to-many to a many-to-many communication style, where everybody can distribute information and become a hub. And that makes it very interesting also for a physicist to look at it as a complex system. And what I would like to give as an impulse is that science communication, and I think at least I had this impression also during the pandemic, but overall is subject to the so-called attention economy, which is, I think, one of the main, so to say, incentive structures of this information ecosystem, because we went into a commercialized situation of platforms who are serving as distributors and platforms, as they are called, and they act in their economic structures, and there is sometimes little regard for quality and maybe for scientific quality. And I would say that is one of my interests, and I think we as scientists and science communicators should be careful to not, so to say, fall prey for this incentive structure of the attention economy, and by that erode the quality of our communication.
Thanks, Philipp. Let me just quickly follow up with a question. I'm just curious, because you said everybody can be a hub now. Are you a hub? Are you communicating on Twitter, on Facebook, or have you decided to kind of like stay out of that?
I feel that nowadays, especially Twitter for scientists, is quite an important platform. And during the pandemic, I realized it was almost replacing conferences. I can, watch the space and see what papers are emerging. So yes, maybe I'm mostly communicating preaching to the choir and to my other scientist colleagues, and not so much to the public, but I am not yet a hub, I would say, but maybe at some point.
Okay, it's just an interesting question, because when I talk to scientists, it's very interesting that there's a lot of people who are annoyed at the way that information is being transmitted or shared, but they don't feel comfortable kind of doing it themselves often. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to Natali Helberger. So Natali is a professor for law and AI at the University of Amsterdam. And very happy to have that perspective here, because I think this is something that in my experience is often lacking, the kind of the questions about the regulatory space as well, in which some of these actors in this ecosystem work, is I think really crucial. So very, very curious to hear, Natali.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to update you a bit of what the current regulatory discussion is. And maybe coming back to your hub question, I think I see so much how scientists more and more depend actually on social media to communicate their research finding, like Twitter. I mean, the entire new generation of researchers is using Twitter as the means of communication. So I think the point Philipp made is very relevant, which brings me to regulation, because disinformation is acknowledged not only as a very societal challenge, but also as one of the major policy and regulation problems right now, and is subject to a range of regulatory initiatives at national, European, and international level. And most of these regulatory initiatives indeed focus, as Philipp also already hinted at the vehicles of disinformation. So the algorithmic patterns in the economic and incentive structures that contribute to this widespread proliferation of disinformation, and the role that social media platforms play in that context, which is manifold. I think you hinted already at it, Philipp. They first of all lower the threshold for all of us to share information, good information, but also disinformation. Their algorithmic content moderation strategies and mechanisms for sharing information often function as algorithmic amplifiers for the spread of disinformation. Their business model often profits from the widespread sharing of content, and content going viral because it's based on data-driven advertising. And finally, for some users, they create an environment where it's simply very easy to avoid any news from other sources. The European Commission has proposed the Digital Services Act, which is, I think, right now the most prominent piece of regulation on the table, which will impose additional responsibilities for what they call very large online platforms, speak Google, Facebook, Twitter, and the other big platforms, to tackle the problem of disinformation, for example, by adjusting their content moderation policies or by removing economic incentives for sharing disinformation. In addition, there are extensive provisions on natives and takedown. And because of the sheer amount of content that is being shared online, we also see an increasing reliance on AI-driven tools, also in the Digital Services Act. And this leads us to another important role of law and regulation in that, namely ensuring that content moderation policies and AI-driven tools actually do not violate our freedom of speech rights and our ability to share information. And I think in that respect, it's very disconcerting to see that, especially in relation to the COVID crisis and the proliferation of content related to COVID disinformation, we see more and more national regulators starting to regulate not only this dissemination, but also the making of misinformation, and often the criminal laws. So in other words, the sharing of disinformation is being more and more criminalized. Hungary is an often mentioned example, but we see similar rules in Malta, Czech Republic, or Greece. And sometimes they do so in very vague terms that are open to very broad interpretations, like the Criminal Code of Cyprus, which makes it an offense which can be punished with up to 2 years to disseminate false news or news that can potentially harm civil order or public's trust towards the state. So you already feel the potential tension with freedom of expression, and also the potential for using such broad notions, not only to combat disinformation, but also to censor speech. Which brings me to my last point, some of the risks of regulation. One is over-regulation, but also using disinfo as a trigger to lower the threshold for state censorship, or censorship-like rules. Another danger is over-reliance on technical solutions, because a lot of information very much depends on the context. And at the moment, our AI systems are not far enough to be able to really recognize that. So finally, there's a real risk that regulatory attempts will focus on the cure of the symptoms, but fail to take into account the bigger systemic picture. Because ultimately, the only, I think, really sustainable solution to the problem of disinformation lies in the creation of a healthy, diverse, and competitive public spheres. Also in academia, actually, different platforms where we can publish and reach people, and where people can be exposed to various sources of information, including fact-checked and quality information. And I think there's an important task for governments to create the conditions for such a healthy media landscape to flourish. And with that, I would like to conclude.
Thank you very much, Natali. Just one question also. So I've spent a lot of time in the last months thinking about, the parallels between the information ecosystem we live in and the ecosystem as we think of it out there in the biosphere. And one of the things that really strikes me that you alluded to is that ecosystem is changing at a breakneck pace. I mean, every change in the algorithms that one of these big players makes can basically change the way that this whole ecosystem kind of functions in quite significant ways. So when we talk about, I mean, that is a problem, I think, partly when we're talking about people studying this ecosystem. It's very hard to study something that's constantly changing, right? But at the same time, I wonder when we're talking about regulation, how much of a problem that is, to really get regulation that gets at the issues when policy proceeds at a pace that is so much slower usually. It's something that's very similar to what we're seeing in the pandemic in some ways, where we're also having this kind of like, how slow are parliamentary processes and how fast is this pandemic moving? So I'm curious what you think, whether there's a clear solution, especially on the EU level where stuff takes even longer.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it's something that we hear often, that law is always trotting behind the technological facts. I see it more differentiated. So laws should not regulate particular technologies or particular applications of technologies, but laws should formulate rules and principles that order the way those using the technologies behave. And ideally, these are rules and technologies that are applicable on a broader framework on some pieces of legislation that we have. Take, for example, data protection, which dates back to the basic principles laid down in the first data protection directive, date back to 1995, which is, in terms of internet, I mean, ancient, right? And the basic principles are still the same. So I think good rules do not regulate technologies, but basic principles for using technologies.
Let me just follow up, because it feels like a lot of the regulation that we're seeing is regulating maybe not technologies, but certain players. I mean, certainly what's happening in the US, the laws that are being drafted at the moment, also what's happening in the EU, there's a threshold. There's this idea that, basically companies that are very, very big have to adhere to that. And usually that's defined in a way that you end up with the really big players like Facebook, Instagram, Apple, Google, or Amazon. So in some ways, aren't we still, not regulating the ecosystem itself, but rather like the biggest players, when maybe we should be regulating the ecosystem in a way that we don't even get these huge players?
Oh, these are, you sneaked in 2 or 3 questions into that one. Okay, we also never regulate single companies, but there is a tradition to regulate companies that have a particular impact on markets and a lot of market power. So that is one of the core tenets of competition policies and specialized competition policies. And that's also what we're seeing right now happening in Europe and in the US. And there, the role of law is to, on the one hand, create the conditions so that there can be fair competition. And indeed, as you said, also created conditions so that actually these big concentrations of market power cannot happen in the first place, at least in Europe. This is one of the reasons, for example, why we saw that we don't have similar big players like in the US. And in the past, there have been, for example, attempts by publishers to get together and form a platform that could compete with the big US platforms, which was impossible because of our very strict competition laws and antitrust laws. So yes, ideally, it should have been the task of law to avoid these big concentrations. The US approach to competition law is a bit left more room for these companies to grow that fast. And now an important role for law is to create the conditions for competition, and for governments actually to finally start thinking about investing in alternative digital infrastructures and removing our over-reliance on these big platforms. I think they have a place in our ecosystem, but as you already said, I mean, one change of Facebook and entire media companies go bankrupt. So I think that illustrates how incredibly dependent we have made ourselves. And this is something that we have seen even more so in COVID. And I think we should really be concerned about and start investing in alternatives also.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Natali. I want to bring in our third panelist, Dan Larhammar. He's a professor in molecular cell biology at Uppsala University, and we're kind of moving from the big ecosystem question here a little bit more towards fake news in particular and ways to combat it. And Dan has a lot of experience in doing that for many years. So very curious to hear from you. You're still on mute, sorry.
Thank you very much, Kai. Let me share my screen with you to show a few pictures. And I hope you can see this now. Exactly 1 year ago, I had the honor and pleasure.
Dan, can you change the view to the presentation?
Okay, it's swapped back again.
Swap back.
Okay, yeah,
Perfect.
There we go. All right, so exactly 1 year ago, I had the pleasure and honor to lead a working group, a scientific committee within ALLEA, with the mission to address the problems fact or fake, and how especially scientists and science communicators can deal with this demanding situation that we find ourselves in since several years now. Here is the list of members of the committee, and I'm sure you can recognize several prominent names here. I think we heard Maria Bagramian in a discussion yesterday, and there may be others who are participating in this conference as well. Our task was to look specifically at 3 focus areas, as we call them: climate change, the situation with vaccines and the anti-vax movement, and the COVID-19 pandemic that was just a few months old when this committee was initiated. And we worked to identify the problems and the structure of disinformation in societies and how it spreads. And here are some of the main points that we identified. And for me, as a neuroscientist studying the brain, it's especially intriguing to find that, a bit ironically, the new knowledge and the new research on disinformation spread actually tells us something about how the human brain functions, how we are appealed by certain types of information and how tempting it can be to transmit it further. So built in our system, so to speak, is, for instance, the stickiness of false information and how we can be resistant to new knowledge that does not appeal to us. In fact, a few years ago, together with 2 colleagues, I organized a conference with the title "Knowledge Resistance and How to Cure It." I think it was the first of its kind, and that was also very informative and contained a lot of information on psychology. We can see how the disinformants work by sneaking in words from science to make them look scientific, although they are not. The recipients soak up information that appeals to them, so confirmation bias is a strong component in this. And I'm sure you're all aware of the famous Dunning-Kruger effect, where a little bit of knowledge makes us very proud and think that we know it all, and eagerly transmit our limited knowledge to others. But as we learn more about something, we realize that our knowledge was perhaps not as widespread as we were thinking. And as we just heard in the other introductions here, we also have the problems with close communities creating filter bubbles around them. And within that bubble, they have generated an echo chamber where only certain claims are allowed. And as we heard several times yesterday, conspiracy theories are also part of this. So what can we do about it? Our report, and I will show you the link in a moment, arrived at a number of recommendations for scientists, science communicators, and also things to be aware of for policymakers. And I will just highlight a couple of those. So as several others have pointed out, we need to raise science literacy in the society at large. And we need to make people aware of the way the social platforms work. Scientists need to be more active in the dialogue, and especially with science communicators who can convey the scientific information further. We should also try to explain how science works. And as we have all seen, COVID-19 has generated fantastic opportunities to do that, because at the research front, knowledge is still a bit uncertain. We need to interact more closely with society, with people in societies. We ourselves need to express ourselves carefully and be aware, and also say so, that the new knowledge can be a bit uncertain. We must keep our own act clean and make sure that science and research misconduct is looked after and prevented as much as possible. We should be transparent also with the communication processes, so that we can maintain honesty and maintain the trust in science and research. Trust needs to be deserved. In our report, we have a figure which summarizes some of the things that scientists and the communicators can do, and also some of the things that we should not do. So to end, let me point out that some of the ways whereby we can work is to inoculate against misinformation. And when it has happened, we need to be active in debunking. We propose finally that we should strive together, because there are so many activities going on now, so many initiatives. So we recommend more interaction between these, so that we don't duplicate efforts, to see what we can do about it. There should be a network for this. And we should also recommend ways to transmit information about research to scientists. I would think that for most of us who are attending this symposium, this is rather obvious, but for the individual scientist, I think some of the recommendations may be helpful. So I'm sure that Daniel Keisel will put up the link in the chat for this report, and I recommend all of you to take a look at it. And with that, I close my initial presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. And I think the link is already in the chat. Let me just ask you, I mean, given that you've looked at this for a long time already, I mean, one of the debates I think that's kind of going on in the background is whether this pandemic has exacerbated some of these issues, or whether we're just seeing them more clearly because we're all having the same conversation, for instance. Like, I'm sometimes struck by the fact that people probably believe a lot of fake news and crazy stuff, but I don't usually talk to them about it. But with this pandemic, every time I walk past someone who's not wearing a mask, you know, I have that conversation. All the conversations that are happening on the street are about this pandemic. So I'm curious whether you think the problem has become bigger, or we're just becoming more aware of it in a way.
The easy answer is both, because many of the things that we are witnessing now are not new. For instance, the propagation of alternative medicine cures, those were very quick to start. Only a few weeks after the pandemic was announced, there were companies offering their services, and they could not possibly have developed those that quickly. And unfortunately, they received governmental support from some governments around the world. But we're also seeing some attempts that are more cynical than I think I've seen before. So the situation has been exacerbated. For instance, companies offering fake tests for COVID-19, or offering the service but are not doing the test at all. We just had such a case here in Sweden a few days ago. And of course, this is playing with people's lives. So I think this is a really horrible and disgusting thing to see.
I mean, one of the problems we have, I think, when we're talking about fake news is that it's not black and white, right? We don't have, like, it's very hard sometimes to, I mean, there's stuff where we know that's very clearly fake news. And then there's a lot of stuff which is maybe badly reported. You know, there's also journalists who write stories that are very misleading without being fake news. I wonder, how do you, when we're talking about fake news for yourself, when you were doing this ALLEA statement, for instance, how do you distinguish that? Like, what is it that you're focusing on when you're saying fake news in that case? Is it, yeah.
Yeah, well, what we strongly recommend is that everyone who is reporting and writing about COVID-19 must check the sources of the information and do the groundwork. I know that's not easy for general journalists who are not trained in checking medical literature. So the big news agencies, the news media, must rely on expertise, and hopefully we should see in the near future more science journalists who know the tricks of that trade, so that they can stop the really exaggerated headlines in the news media. But then again, we of course will still have the minor news outlets and those that are on web platforms that do not have this checking service at all. So we will see all kinds. But checking sources, I think, is the #1 item we must recommend.
It's interesting. I think we'll get back to that in the debate later, because of course the thing about this pandemic is that depending on who your sources and who you talk to, your scientists do have different opinions, and you know, and because it changes, some people also might just not be up to date. But I think we'll go back to that. We do have one more input first. This is from Dietram Scheufele. Dietram Scheufele studies science communication at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, where it's the middle of the night at the moment, which is why he's not joining us live, but instead he has kindly sent a video of a few minutes, an overview from his perspective of fake news. Yes, please play.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having me, and most importantly, my apologies, my sincerest apologies for not being able to be there in person, certainly not synchronously, but between the conference moving virtual and me not being able to travel this week, this was just the only way to reasonably participate in this. Thank you also to the organizers for letting me do a short impulse talk, and I want to start that by pointing to a resource that's open access by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences here in the US, a collection of articles that I helped co-edit, but that were contributed by scholars and practitioners, all working on misinformation in science, both in the practice and the research field. So what I think is a great resource. If you're interested, I certainly encourage you to check it out. I want to give you 3 somewhat provocative statements, and the first one has something to do with the infodemic that we're talking about, that term often being used in the wrong way. The WHO meant it as this deluge of information that's coming our way, way too much for us to separate signal from noise and dis and misinformation from accurate information. It's often misunderstood as just misinformation, this infodemic. And I'm calling it here the latest white whale, in a little nod to Melville. But what I mean by that is we have become obsessed in science communication with fighting misinformation. And I want to put 3 asterisks, or at least cautionary notes on this. Number 1 is we know very little about there being more misinformation. Just because the WHO says it doesn't mean it's true. And it's very unclear if there's more mis and disinformation during COVID, or was during COVID, than there was before. In fact, a lot of the tropes that we were seeing during COVID, a lot of the conspiratorial thinking around Gates pushing vaccines simply for personal gain or for population control and other outlandish claims, have been around forever, and they were just being reused for COVID-19. And the impression that a lot of us have that there is more misinformation is largely driven by the fact that we're all sitting at home 24/7 during curfews and stay-at-home orders, watching our phones and following all this misinformation along. Number 2, and this is more important, even if there is more misinformation, let's follow that line of argument just for the sake of argument, there's very little social scientific evidence, if any, to suggest that information directly connects to more pro-social behaviors. For example, physical distancing, getting vaccines when they're available, and so on and so forth. My colleague Dominique Broussard spoke about this quite powerfully in an interview with JAMA, where she talked about the social science that doesn't establish a link between people actually knowing more about the science and engaging in behavior that's more in line with scientific evidence. The third one, and this is maybe the most important one, is we all want to correct misinformation just out of a well-meaning effort. But there are potential downsides. Number one, backfire effects. Do those happen all the time or most of the time? No. Do they happen sometimes for certain pockets of people? Absolutely. Meaning if we argue that, and if we show people all the factual information that shows that they're wrong for things that they feel strongly about, they may dig in even deeper and become more entrenched in their behaviors that are at odds with the best available science. In fact, by giving a voice to misinformation, by repeating it, by debunking it on CNN, in the New York Times, or on various websites, we increase the salience. Most people never saw the primary tweets that Trump put out, but they saw them, his tweets on COVID-19, but they saw them on CNN, repeated and debunked, and as a result, they learned in the first place what he was saying. This is even more problematic in algorithmically curated environments, Twitter, Facebook, where a lot of our news feeds come from, because the more we engage with items in those algorithmically curated environments, the higher they end up on everybody's timeline. Social engagement is a large driver behind algorithmic prominence. And so ultimately, by correcting, by mocking, by retweeting just to make fun of a piece of misinformation, we amplify its reach and amplify its shelf life, its half-life, as it sticks around much longer than it otherwise would have. The second, again, maybe too strongly worded, but intentionally so for a provocative statement, is that during COVID, scientific facts, as opposed to misinformation, themselves have been pretty elusive. A lot of science that we started out with turned out to be wrong, and we knew this at the beginning of the pandemic. Adam Marcus and Ivan Oransky wrote about this in Wired more than a year ago. We knew that we would do science with a lot of trial and error, and a lot of studies that would come out would turn out not to be right. The problem that we had was twofold. A, we had to make policy based on that science, because we needed policy decisions around a rapidly spreading pandemic. And B, we had to correct misinformation that we knew to be wrong with science that we weren't quite sure would turn out to be right. And that second part is a really complicated catch-22 for science to be in. And policy-wise, of course, that translated into things like our stance on AstraZeneca, which we eventually concluded did not cause blood clots among certain patient populations, and was safe for older populations, and Angela Merkel, of course, very publicly getting the vaccine. But you got that plus minus 2 weeks of Denmark coming out and saying, well, we're not doing this at all. We're not giving this to anybody. So for any normal consumer, for any casual news consumer, this was a fairly confusing scientific and policy environment. That makes the distinctions between mis and disinformation and accurate information murky at best. Number three, I think science is not very good at answering questions that people actually care about. Science is really good at answering the questions that science think people should have asked, but science is really bad at answering questions that people really are asking. And for most people, COVID-19 was not about the science or even about public health. It should have been, but it wasn't. It was about the economy. It was about individual liberties. It was about their right to see friends. It was about their lives being upended and disrupted. So how do we meaningfully speak, while we're faithful to the science, how do we meaningfully speak to issues that publics do care about, different publics do care about? Number one, things like terms like herd immunity are a bad term. They imply that we're sheep, we're following blindly. They make a lot of sense technically to the scientific community, but a term like community immunity, looking out for fellow church members, fellow members of my sports team, neighbors that live in the same neighborhood, community immunity is a much better label, a much better frame, to speak social science for a second here, than herd immunity. But we keep using herd immunity and being surprised that people don't find this a very appealing value proposition. Number two, are we answering the questions that people are really asking in terms of how we describe the issue? Yes, COVID is a public health issue, as we just talked about, but it is an economic issue. And if I really care about my small business going under, if you tell me that we're losing $56 per every person who's not wearing a mask per day in the US, and we've spent hundreds of millions of days with people not wearing masks, which scales up pretty quickly to huge amounts of money that the economy is losing and that we're not putting back into small businesses. All of a sudden, the more conservative audiences, or the more conservative audience, are beginning to listen to an argument that resonates with them rather than an argument that we think should resonate with them. The last one is an argument that I think is important for all of us, a reminder that's important for all of us, and that is, it's a highly complex problem. It does not have simple solutions. Yet we're looking for, in the social science literature and elsewhere, for the one thing that will fix our problem. Can we inoculate people against misinformation? Can we consensus message, and then people realize that every scientist feels that way, and then they will come along? And the answer is, these things work in the lab sometimes on very carefully selected populations that get exposed to a certain stimulus, but they don't scale. And there's very little social scientific evidence that and to none, I would say, that a single intervention will solve a highly complex problem that ranges from algorithms to individual decision making, from scientific uncertainties to policy complexities. The idea that there's a silver bullet is wrong. It's misguided, and it's ultimately dangerous because we're promising a solution that we know from the social science we won't be able to deliver on.
Yeah, so that was Dietram Scheufele, who sadly won't be here to answer some questions, but he is on Twitter if you want to ask him questions later. I want to just make 2 points. I mean, one is the last point he makes about there not being silver bullets. I think that's well taken, and I do think this is in accordance with something that Dan said earlier. In science journalism, for instance, we constantly create this expectation of the way that we write about science. We misrepresent the process of science, how it works in the first place. And then, because we're focusing on results and not the process, and then what we're also always doing is kind of, to hype a headline, it has to be the silver bullet. Something always has to be the solution of a problem. It can't just be part of a bigger solution. I think that's something that structurally is a problem in science journalism. But I wanted to ask Philipp, first of all, about something that Dietram said, and partly because you looked like you were violently disagreeing with it, but maybe I'm wrong. But Dietram said in the beginning that there's very little evidence that the information that people have on these scientific questions actually influences how they end up behaving, and consequently that misinformation doesn't necessarily change their behavior. And I'm curious, when you look at your own research as well, what do we know about the impact that these kind of fake news actually have? I hear it a lot that people say, oh, people are just consuming this for fun. People don't actually believe there's a chip in the vaccines. How much of an impact does it actually have?
Yeah, thank you. I was also raising my eyebrows, because
Backfire effect.
I recently read a paper that reported at least causal inference about exposure to misinformation and vaccine hesitancy. So where I think I was relatively convinced about the study that there can be made a connection, and that is real life behavior. And I just want to stay away from these black and white pictures. So it's not that there is no effect of information on behavior. And it's probably also not the case that everything we read, we directly translate and go out in the world and do what we just read. So I would just not like to stick to the point that there's no evidence that there's any connection, because then this whole information ecosystem wouldn't play a role anyways, and we could just leave it as an entertainment platform. And I think that might have been true for the early days of the internet, where mainly funny memes were shared, but now day-to-day politics are being made on Twitter. And I think we all realize, and especially in the pandemic, where a lot of public sphere happened online, that it plays an increasingly important role. And I don't think it will go away or it will stay small or something like that, but I rather think it will increasingly become the public sphere. So I just don't want to diminish that role. And I was also raising, maybe you've seen that, a similar point about the backfire effect. I also want to, you know, relativize that at least, where I am aware of several studies and also review studies who are arguing against this backfire effect. So this is an active debate, just wanted to highlight that. And it could be that for some people who are very much, and maybe these people have different motives for believing misinformation that are maybe coupled to their social identity and have polarized opinions. That could be that in these communities you see backfire effects, but many of the interventions talking about inoculation and other accuracy hints are often meant for the, so to say, the public that is not on the edges of the political spectrum and might be motivated very much by their partisan convictions. And there, I think we should be more hopeful in that science communication can actually end up with these people and actually reach people and also influence behavior. So.
Right. I mean, it's interesting. We could have a whole panel just about the backfire effect, because there's really been a lot of debate about it recently. But what I find interesting about the argument that Dietram makes is that apart from the psychological backfire effect, he also makes it very clear that because of the way that the algorithms are structured and the way that these players in the ecosystem work, that there is a very real effect of, I mean, we all know that these players want to increase engagement. So even if you're debunking something, it isn't engagement, right? I mean, so before I get to Natali, I wanted to ask Dan as well. I mean, since you've thought a lot about how to counter fake news, is it a bit of a dilemma? Because anything you do, I mean, it's a little bit like that back fact, or the Barbara Streisand effect. Like you're calling attention to something that you're really trying to get out of the public sphere in a way. How do you deal with that, and how do you decide when something rises to the level where you actually need to engage with it? How should science journalists do that?
Yeah, I think one has to decide that on a case-to-case basis, whether one should hope that those particular fake news fade away, or whether they become a problem that needs responses from the scientific community. So one cannot generalize. Also, an important component there is what potential harm it can do. I mean, even a recipe published in a book for cooking food, if it contains a toxic ingredient, that can cause death. Then the authorities need to warn against that, and ideally the publisher should withdraw that book. But of course, one will generate a lot of attention around that. So one has to value that against the potential consequences. And as we heard from Dietram, the problem is very complex. There is certainly no silver bullet. And the different target audiences are differentially receptive to the information that we try to provide. So we have the whole range of possible responses. And I think we should be aware that we cannot reach the ardent anti-vaxxers. They have already painted themselves into a corner and will not be accessible with rational arguments. But we have a much larger group that are still accessible with rational arguments. And those are the ones that we want to reach so that they can make informed decisions.
I mean, that's a really interesting point, because I feel like we've had that debate in vaccination for a long time. It's not about the anti-vaxxers, it's about the people who are kind of on the fence, or maybe they're just not trying very hard to get the vaccine, and it's not easy enough for them to get it. And all of that is well taken. But I do wonder, and this goes into a question for Natali, but I wonder, isn't what we're seeing, we don't have a political scientist really on the panel, but isn't what we're seeing the fact that the platforms that we have and the information ecosystem that we have is leading to this increasing polarization. And this increasing polarization is exactly increasing the groups that are harder to reach in a way. And I'm curious whether basically the aim of regulation has to be to make sure that there is still kind of like this group in the middle that can then kind of, you know, be reached by reasonable information if we have to. I'm curious, Natali, how you think about this, and whether that is the core of it, or what you think when you see Dietram's talk.
Yeah, excellent question. Well, I think there's no denying that the affordances of digital communication technology offers new forms of amplification of something that has always been there already. So, I mean, disinformation is a problem that we had before platforms as well, and I think we should be very aware. And partly it's also a societal problem, and it's a professional practice problem. And I think Professor Larhammar made this point very clearly. It also has to do with our own professional diligence. So while I very much recognize that platforms are part of the problem, I'm also a bit hesitant to point them out as the main culprits. And because on the one hand, this promises an easy fix, you know, just regulate platforms and all will be well. So this is not the way it's going. And I think the Dietram's contribution made me very aware that we should be even more careful with regulating until we really understand what the effects are and if they're backfire effects or not. Because, I mean, this regulation, I mean, right now, some countries are making it a criminal offense to spread disinformation, even if it's, you know, not unlawful. So if we don't understand the effects this will have on people, this could be potentially huge infringement of Article 10, but also our academic freedoms to communicate. And I also think that, of course, there are economic incentives for sharing information, but I think we should also be aware that there are also scientific incentives for sharing this information. The pressure, I mean, journalists are also often complaining because of the internet, information has to be produced faster, spread wider, and so far. And I think to some extent, this is true for academics as well. I mean, we need to be relevant, we need to be every day on Twitter, we need to be read. There's a huge competition for attention also of the academic community, as also Philipp made the point, which also sometimes tends to be an incentive for us to spread information before it's fully fact-checked or very well checked whether the formulation couldn't be misinterpreted. So platforms are an amplifier, and I think we really have to learn how to deal with the amplification effect. But I think it's also a deeper structural and societal problem we need to deal with, and simply regulating platform won't solve the issue. Something that we see in the DSA, which is quite interesting, is that another part of regulation is very much actually also laying down, outsourcing the task by independent fact checkers, scientists, citizens to help solving the problem. And I think that is a good step, but at the moment it's very much a commitment on paper. And I think what we really should think about is how can we improve the conditions of all of us to, contributing to a more truthful ecosystem.
I think that's a really, really crucial point. I keep going back to the individual because, you know, no matter what you can do, you know, with the big platforms, in the end, it comes, if everybody's sharing information, it does come down to everyone, right? I take Dietram's point that community immunity is way better than herd immunity, but there is a concept that I kind of read on Twitter during the pandemic, which I really liked, which was nerd immunity, right? This idea that if people, you know enough to not spread certain pieces of misinformation, just like people wearing a mask won't spread the virus, then if enough of the population is inoculated against fake news, then it can't spread anymore and the population has reached nerd immunity. I kind of like that just because it kind of focuses the attention on the individual. There's this idea that now everybody's basically an editor, everybody's a journalist, everybody's sending out information, so everybody should also have the kind of tools that a journalist has in terms of like evaluating information and so on and so on. And is that, to all of you, is that realistic? I mean, it feels to me like, again, we're talking about timescales that are, you know, like teaching in schools, like giving people, you know, making people more critical about sources and information. is that too little too late in a way? And I mean, yeah, just curious what all of you think. Go ahead, Philipp.
May I speak to that quite directly, because we are thinking about such solutions. We are very much, because I'm working a lot with psychologists now, very much concerned about the individual and the individual competences. Media literacy is one of them that we are looking at. And yes, school education takes a lot of time. And what I want to raise is that it's maybe not super helpful to separate the individual and the decision making from the ecosystem within it takes place, because it's a not even separatable. So we are not making decisions in a vacuum, and we are very sensitive to details, especially, for example, social details, like who is around us and to whom do we spread things. So I think at least in our research, we try to have these two target points. On one hand, we have to improve the environment. We have to provide the conditions so that you can actually do fact checking, and your attention is not directed to just the next article and to the next headline, but that the sources are prominently displayed. I mean, this is going into very detail of the design sometimes, and this will make it difficult for regulation. However, I think this is a necessary step, because if we look and say in the end it's a person sharing that, and that's true, we have to think about their individual situation in this decision environment. And the other one is, yes, competences, they have to be fostered, and they are very, some of these competences are unique to the online domain, and there are other ways to do that, not just with school education that takes many years, but there are small interventions, inoculation being one of them, which is, so to say, not taking wrong information and amplifying it that exists already, but exposing people to this strategy, which is maybe very generalizable before and prior they encounter information. By that, you teach people this competence to be critical, to look at these strategies. That's just one of these examples, and I'm totally on board with the we cannot come up with a silver bullet idea. So, but these two target points, and if they go hand in hand, so just think about how we probably all learned how to use Wikipedia and how to click on these sources and links, and that's an environment that makes it much easier to do research, so to say. And I think if then we come up with this whole battery, we might reach a point where also the individual learns quite quick to find their ways in this chaotic environment. But it's a challenge, obviously, and I think we shouldn't spare schools, because that's super important as well. But we also shouldn't think that there is this digital native idea that it will all solve itself by another generation growing up and they will find their ways automatically. There are studies where also even university students are falling prey for misinformation. So I think we have to do something, but it's not necessarily too slow.
Right. Sorry, Natali, you wanted to say something to that?
I love the nerd immunity thing, and listening to Philipp, I mean, in the beginning of the internet, when everybody used the internet, we were talking about netiquette, so maybe we're nerd and nerdiquette or something like that to learn behavior.
Yeah, I mean, I keep in the beginning when we were talking about this, I always said, you know, everybody's learning good hand hygiene now, but we should also be learning good information hygiene. Obviously, you know, we're also spreading a lot of stuff without thinking about it. But Dan, I wanted to ask, given, so a lot of the debate here is, okay, let's try and get the public to understand a little bit more about science, about how science works, give them good science information. Of course, there's the other side to this that I think Dietram alluded to when he said science is very bad at actually answering the questions that society cares about. And I wonder whether this is a big part of the problem here. Whenever I talk to scientists now about the fake news and science communication, I get a lot of, yes, we need to improve the way that the information flows from the scientists to the public. I think the fundamental fact that the ecosystem has shifted and it doesn't go one way anymore hasn't quite reached everyone. And I wonder, do scientists also have to accept that society is going to play a larger role in a way in in their daily work, and also has to inform partly how they do their work and maybe even what they do sometimes.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very good thing. Many researchers do the research because they want to find new knowledge. And of course, the greatest thing that new knowledge can do is reach everyone who is affected or should be aware of it. So we definitely should focus both on answering the questions that the general public, that people in general have, but also inform about the scientific processes and progress, because the general public may not even know what questions they should be asking. One needs a little bit of science literacy to be able to do that. And I think with increased communication both ways, this can be improved greatly.
I want to try and I kind of try to weave in a little bit of the audience questions already, but I want to get to a few very directly. There is one, do you think this is a problem? Sorry, this is for Natali. Do you think this is a problem of the left or right? And what do you think of deplatforming speakers for views people do not agree with, but which are not illegal? There's another question that goes a little bit into this idea of cancel culture. On a very basic level, what is your take on that?
It relates a bit to what we also discussed earlier, freedom of expression. So removing people from a forum that has become very important communication channel is very problematic from a freedom of expression point of view. And that's why I'm also so careful with regulation and over-regulation, because there's always the imminent danger that this is not contributing to information hygiene, but outright censorship. On the other hand, I think what you're alluding to is, for example, the events at Capitol Hill. And to some extent, I also think we need to acknowledge that there's certain forms of communication that are simply extremely anti-democratic, and then they do not any longer deserve freedom of expression protection. And this is the kind of information that we need to stop from spreading. But before doing such an intervention, I think we need a very, very solid process to of due process to make sure that we do not censor speech.
Do you think Twitter and Facebook were right to ban Donald Trump? Out of curiosity, because that's a very prominent example.
In that context, actually calling a president calling the population to actually storm the Capitol and violate democratic processes is simply unlawful behavior, and unlawful behavior is prohibited and banished. I think the question is then, for how long do you ban him? The problem with a lot of disinformation is that it's not unlawful per se, and we have to be careful before we banish that one.
Dan?
I'd just like to add to this aspect of legislation that we should be very careful to restrict freedom of expression. And this is something that we bring up in our ALLEA report, Fact or Fake, namely that it would be very difficult sometimes to distinguish fake news from pranks and satire. And we know all in science how useful it is to plant pranks to show which journals are predatory journals and are ready to publish any junk as long as the authors pay. And we need to have this tool of satire and sarcasm in our discussion in societies. So we should be careful with the legislation.
And of course, there's a lot of undemocratic governments that are very happy to see democratic governments have, implement rules like this, which they can point to when trying to stifle, a legitimate political debate in their countries. I wanted to get back because the question also asked about, is this a problem of the left or the right? And then that brings me to something else, which I find interesting here. Again, we don't have a political scientist here, but how do you think about this? Because when it comes to climate change, it was kind of always obvious ideologically what someone would fall into, right? There's a reason that the right pro-economic side is kind of like skeptical of climate change or denies it. With the pandemic, it feels like I couldn't have predicted that the right would be pro-hydroxychloroquine and anti-mask. I mean, it could have gone the other way, no? So I'm wondering, is it just at this point, is polarization so strong that this is just tribal affiliation? Somebody says we're team camp, and somebody else team mask, and someone else says we're team hydroxychloroquine, and then everybody follows that? Or is there a reason? Is there a pattern behind the fake news or the misinformation we see? Whoever wants to take that, I'm not sure. Philipp?
And just to support your last point, that there is this idea of a social reinforcement mechanism that regards several topics, and I've been working on polarization a bit, where your social surrounding influences your opinion on a certain topic, which is maybe not even related to your partisan agenda, but just the surrounding has a self-reinforcement effect that can happen. However, I think that the search for truth, so to say, is not a very partisan question. At least I've seen studies, and also we have studied the attitudes towards personalization, and it was very unpolarized, the answers, that people do all not like to get personalized or algorithmically curated news, for example. So I am a bit hopeful here that we are not in a situation where, for example, regulation will not be accepted if it is looking at truth. If it's about specific content, then yes, I mean, then it's getting partisan, and as we just learned. But if it's about, and ideally these interventions or regulation might be then content neutral, I at least think that there might be bipartisan support for that.
Kai, can I add something about the skepticism towards climate change? Because there was an article published last year that actually described that this started as a left-wing critique with the social constructivists in the 1960s and 70s that started to question what scientists, biologists, climate scientists were saying. But then this has switched to be a mostly right-wing skepticism today. So that's a very interesting journey that issue has performed during those years. That study was published by Professor Sven Ove Hansson at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm.
If you have a link to that, I'd be curious if you could share it later.
It's cited in our report from ALLEA.
Perfect. I wanted to actually maybe briefly move to news you can use. There's a lot of questions in the chat asking, how to combat fake news, on different topics. I don't think we can go through the different topics here, but I did want to, give each of you an opportunity just to make a round of, what would you say to people? What are your tips to fight fake news as a science communicator? What should people keep in mind?
Maybe one thing is, from what I started with, is that one should be aware to be a hub and the responsibilities. I like the point by Dan about being open about uncertainty, and as I tried to say in the beginning, not falling prey to the attention economy. So rather use a boring headline and put all the sources on the bottom. And then, of course, I mean, if the ecosystem then is really against you, you might not resurface. But I don't think it is a good idea to then bend in and just use a catchy headline and a funny picture to get to the surface.
Can I just, before we move on, does the success of Christian Drosten in Germany with that podcast, which kind of goes against a lot of this, right? Is that, I always wonder, is that something that translates to other things? Or is it simply we're living through this incredible moment and everybody has such a high need for good quality information? I feel like the kind of attention economy that we normally use doesn't really apply in this pandemic, because people think this is life or death. It is life or death in a lot of ways. So they are much clearer, I think, about seeking out good information. It seems to me, at least.
Yeah, I mean, that's a shining example of how differentiated information can actually proliferate this system as well. So yeah, it's probably hopeful. It could be that it was a unique situation where people really spent also a lot of time trying to understand this problem better because it was all affecting us. And if that maybe is not the case in other topics where people rather want to have a quick input about something, then it might not work as well anymore. And that's why I still would argue for improving the ecosystem for such content.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Which maybe also includes starting with the education of scientists, because clear science communication and communication in a way that the journalists will understand and not distort, or can in itself lead to misinformation. That's not easy, right? And we are very deep into our subject, but to communicate it in a clear and still accurate way, that is something that many of us need training in. And if you look at university curricula, this is not typically something that we teach our young researchers. But it is increasingly more important the more we interact also with society, and that academia is also acknowledging its societal role in combating wrong information and conveying good information. So I think the time where we simply communicated via scientific journals is very much over. And I think we much more need to communicate with the public, but this is an art apart that I think many of us can learn still quite a lot about.
Absolutely, more communication and collaboration between scientists and communicators, because both can learn from each other. Scientists need to be more engaged in responding to fake news and disinformation. However, our academic system doesn't really award those efforts. No. So that's something that needs to be improved. It has improved quite a bit during the past 20 or 25 years or so. Before that, it was almost shameful to be engaged in a public debate. Now we all appreciate those scientists who do that. And science communicators also need to be aware that some scientists like to be in the limelight and want media attention. And of course, one should be careful to interact with those. But there's certainly a lot that can be learned in both categories if they communicate with one another.
Dan, do you have a few tips specifically to the question, what would be your tips to fight fake news as a science communicator?
Number one, check sources. Are there commercial or ideological or personal interests in the claims that are reported? That's the number one. And also, if possible, check a couple of different scientists in that field to see whether this represents a consensus view. It doesn't always have to be a consensus view, but if it's not, it needs to be very well supported by data. Check sources.
It's interesting. One of the biggest things I've learned, I think, is when you're trying to combat fake news, is that if you're just taking away someone's belief or someone's fake news, it's very hard. You actually need to replace it with something. So what I've found, like if you take Andrew Wakefield, it is way more powerful to tell the story of how Andrew Wakefield scammed his way, into the Lancet and what his motives were and, his conflicts of interest, than just telling people this was wrong and here's the scientific evidence that it's wrong. So I think, as a journalist, we tell stories and you can tell the stories that debunk it. I'm not a huge fan of the pure debunking pieces in my very limited experience that doesn't work as well. We only have a couple more minutes left, and I just wanted to mention a paper that appeared, I think, 2 days ago. Anyway, there's a perspective in PNAS that talks a little bit. It has a range of interesting authors like Carl Bergstrom, Elke Weber, Ian Cousin, like taken from different fields, and it kind of argues. It goes towards what Natali was saying earlier, that we still need to understand this ecosystem much more. And of course, understanding an ecosystem is a really complicated thing. And so the perspective argues that in a way, this needs to be escalated to be a crisis discipline, to be something like that right now it's about studying interventions. How is collective behavior changed or influenced by information? And I'm just curious whether all three of you could just briefly give an idea of, if we talk about the science side for a second, what would you like scientists to study if we indeed talk about this new field of research, about trying to understand this ecosystem. What could we do? Because like Dietram said, science isn't always good at answering the right questions or even posing them. So I'd really like to know what you think are the questions that we should be tackling scientifically here. Whoever wants to start.
Shall I kick off?
Yes.
Well, I'm a legal scholar, so my primary research interest is how can we rules that regulate the behavior and the expectations of users towards society and public institutions. And I think what is crucial for us to study is actually very much what we discussed today, the impacts that the sources, but also the impact that disinformation and means of tackling disinformation can really have on users. Because before we start regulating, we really should understand the effects of these regulations and whether it's effective or not, which is also very important to understand the proportionality of these activities. And I think one thing I took away from the discussion today is so far that we are far from understanding actually what really the effects of disinformation are, but also certain measures to fight disinformation. And this is something that we really need to consider more in legal research.
I may continue then. I think we've already seen fantastic contributions from studies of human psychology in how we favor certain items, certain pieces of news that appeal to us, as I said in the introduction. And I'm sure that there will be new things that can be discovered in psychology. And ideally, I would like this knowledge to be taught in schools to 10-year-olds and the population at large. Because if we can learn more about the way we tend to respond to things, we can understand why we do that and perhaps begin to question ourselves a little bit. Why does that particular piece of news appeal to me? And scientists in general get more training in doing that. But so if we could convey this to the population at large, I think that could improve the situation at least a little bit.
And I'll add to that, and because it's connecting very well. I like this article because it comes from this complex systems perspective, and a coupled system of many people, which is a social network that we are seeing is a very complex thing, and it has chaotic dynamics, so it's inherently difficult to study. And I think the solutions lie on the individual level. But it will be important in the future to bring this micro perspective from psychology, so we understand on an individual basis why we make this decision to share something, for example, or to believe, scale up to this complex coupled system of many people. And to close this gap, we need more of this interdisciplinary work, especially I think psychologists and collective behavior scientists have to work together. And yeah, we are trying to do this, but it's always difficult to bring large communities together. And what it makes it even more difficult, and I think that's where regulation should also come in, is that we are fighting, so to say, an ecosystem where we do not have the access to all the data and information to, and against a player who can constantly change the rules. And that would make our lives much easier. So first of all, if we have better data access, and if, as we've spoken in the beginning of this, the rules are not constantly changing, because a change in a small rule of a complex system is causing great differences in the dynamics. So yeah, I think we have to ramp up the efforts for data access for scientists. We have to find good ways to do that. I'm totally convinced that we cannot just open up the tabs and release all the data. And we might even think about running larger lab experiments where we bring many people together in a virtual lab and let them interact to understand these complex dynamics better. And yeah, that's a huge challenge and will require a lot of effort, but I hope it will happen.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks to all three of you. I could have easily continued this debate for another hour. I hope we had a chance to continue this debate. It's one of the problems sometimes in journalism as well, is that we keep going back to first principles. And I think we need to kind of build on what we know. So hopefully we have a chance. I am going to try and tweet out some of the links later when I have a chance. And maybe we can continue a little bit of the discussion there. Thanks also to Dietram Scheufele for sending the video. He's also on Twitter. And thanks to all of you. And I very much hope we get to continue this soon.